A bitter wind howled through Pine Valley Basin as a solitary figure emerged from the tree line, his weathered snowshoes leaving precise, measured tracks in the fresh powder. Unlike the typical trappers who passed through these mountains, this one didn't head straight for Timber Creek Trading Post's warmth. Instead, he stood motionless at the forest's edge, studying the settlement below with eyes the color of glacial ice. Before we continue this tale, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed. Tomorrow's story will be even more extraordinary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Nathan Ghost McKinnon hadn't chosen Pine Valley Basin for any particular reason. It was simply another stop along the endless trap lines that had become his life. His buffalo hide coat bore the marks of countless seasons in the wilderness, and the silver streaks in his dark hair caught the winter light like frost on pine needles. The few townsfolk brave enough to be out in the bitter cold quickly averted their gaze, unsettled by his stillness and the way he seemed to meld with the shadows of the pines despite standing in plain sight. The settlement itself was larger than most he'd encountered in the high country. 2 rows of sturdy log buildings lined the snow-packed main path, their smoke-blackened chimneys telling tales of harsh winters and harder lives. The imposing Timber Creek Trading Post dominated the north end, while the newly constructed Silver Pine Saloon attracted weary trappers and miners at the south. Between them, life in Pine Valley Basin played out like a carefully choreographed dance in the bitter cold. Traders haggling over pelts, miners trudging to and from the silver mines, and supply wagons battling the treacherous mountain paths that wound through the surrounding peaks. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine snow, and the wind whistled through the pine forest that pressed close against the settlement's edges. This high up in the Rockies, winter wasn't just a season. It was a state of being, a force that shaped every aspect of life and death in these mountains. Nathan knew this better than most. The wilderness had been his only companion for so long that its rhythms had become his own. The only sound as he finally moved forward was the soft crunch of snow beneath his snowshoes and the barely audible clink of the specialized hunting knives sheathed across his chest. Even his rifle, a custom Hawken worn smooth from years of use, seemed to absorb the mountain silence rather than disturb it. His movements were precise, measured, each step placed with the care of a man who knew that up here, a single mistake could mean death. A young boy building a snowman nearby stopped mid-roll, his mittened hands frozen in place as he watched the stranger glide past like a winter spirit. The child's mother hurried out to pull him close, her eyes darting nervously between Nathan and the saloon, where trouble had been brewing as thick as storm clouds over the peaks. Thomas Wheeler, the aging trading post owner, was stacking firewood when he felt, rather than heard, someone approach. He turned to find the stranger standing there, a bundle of prime beaver pelts in one hand and a worn leather-bound journal in the other. No words were exchanged as Wheeler examined the pelts, just a slight nod acknowledging their exceptional quality. The trader couldn't help but notice how the stranger's coat shifted to reveal a distinctive, long rifle sling, worn in the unique style of the legendary Rocky Mountain trappers, and a pair of precisely balanced throwing knives that seemed to possess the same quiet deadliness as their owner. The weapons weren't displayed with the usual mountain man's bravado. They were simply tools, worn with the same practical necessity as his snowshoes. "These are some of the finest pelts I've seen this season," Wheeler finally said, running his fingers through the thick fur. "You must know the high country well." He studied the stranger's face, weathered by wind and sun, but bearing a stillness that seemed deeper than mere experience. The stranger, Nathan, inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. As he moved to take the offered payment, Wheeler caught a glimpse of something else, a peculiar scar that traced from his right temple to his jaw, the kind that could only come from a close encounter with a grizzly's claws. But there was something about its pattern that suggested the bear hadn't survived the encounter. The seasoned trader had seen enough mountain men to know the difference between someone who trapped for profit and someone who had become one with the wilderness. Most trappers who came through were rough men with rough ways, full of wild tales and wilder ambitions. But this one had the quiet grace of a mountain lion, the patient stillness of a winter-locked lake. This man wasn't just surviving in the wilderness. He was part of it. The sound of rough laughter drew Nathan's attention to the Silver Pines Saloon across the way. Through the frost-covered windows, he could see members of the Carson gang sprawled across several tables, already deep in their cups despite the early hour. Steam rose from their wet boots propped up on tables, and the smell of cheap whiskey seemed to seep through the walls into the clean mountain air. The notorious outlaws had been terrorizing the mountain settlements for months, using the treacherous terrain and bitter weather to evade the law. They knew that up here help was as scarce as warmth in winter. Rumor had it they were planning something big, capitalizing on the isolation that winter brought to these high-altitude communities. As Nathan watched, Jake Butcher Carson grabbed a serving girl's arm, yanking her onto his lap while his companions roared with approval. The Blackwood cousins, Eli and Ezra, were using their knives to carve crude designs into a table, their matching wolf fur coats marking them as the gang's scouts. The pelts had been poorly cured, Nathan noted, taken from wolves killed for sport rather than necessity. The girl's face showed fear, but also resignation. This wasn't the first time, and the town's marshal was conveniently snowed in at a lower elevation. For a moment, something flickered in Nathan's glacial eyes, a hint of emotion quickly buried beneath his customary stillness. He'd sworn to avoid trouble, to keep to his trap lines, to stay away from the complications that came with civilization. The wilderness was simpler. It killed honestly, without malice. But as he stood there, the weight of his Hawken rifle felt heavier than usual, like an old friend nudging him toward an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, he knew, the most dangerous predators weren't the ones with claws and fangs. Stay tuned to find out what happens next in this tale of wilderness justice. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the moment when these outlaws learn why some called him Ghost, and not because of how he moved through the snow. Hannah Wheeler approached her father's trading post with an armload of supplies, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid mountain air. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-packed street, and the wind carried the sharp scent of pine and wood smoke. As the trader's daughter and the settlement's only skilled healer, she'd learned to read people as carefully as she read the weather signs in these treacherous peaks. 3 years of tending to the wounds of miners, trappers, and those who crossed the Carson gang had taught her to spot trouble before it erupted. Something about the quiet stranger made her pause, taking in his measured stance and the way his glacial eyes continuously scanned his surroundings, missing nothing. His stillness reminded her of the mountain cats she sometimes glimpsed while gathering herbs. Not the stillness of fear, but of absolute readiness. The weapons he carried weren't displayed with the usual trapper's bravado. They were worn with the same casual necessity as his snowshoes, each one positioned for swift, efficient access. Unlike the others who hurried past with downcast eyes, she met his gaze directly. The silver streaks in his dark hair caught the winter light, matching the ice-rimmed edges of his scarred face. "You might want to move your trap line east of Thunder Ridge," she said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who'd survived more than one mountain winter. "The Carson gang's been marking their territory up there. 3 trappers went missing last month." She nodded toward the saloon, where more raucous laughter spilled into the street. "They're getting bolder with the heavy snows." Nathan turned those winter-cold eyes on her, and for the first time that day, spoke. His voice was soft as falling snow, but clear as creek ice. "Appreciate the warning, miss. Though in my experience, 2-legged predators aren't so different from the 4-legged kind. They both get careless when they think they own the territory." Hannah noticed how he shifted slightly, always keeping the saloon in his peripheral vision. "You've dealt with their kind before," she said. It wasn't a question. The scar on his face might have come from a grizzly, but the wariness in his eyes spoke of wounds that ran deeper than flesh. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the saloon. The Blackwood cousins had spilled out onto the snow-covered boardwalk, dragging a young miner between them. The man's face was bloodied, his clothes torn, and Hannah recognized him as Daniel Cooper, one of the newly arrived miners working the Silver Creek claim. His wife had just given birth last week. Hannah had helped deliver the baby herself. Think you can cheat at cards, boy? Eli Blackwood snarled, his wolf fur coat streaked with the miner's blood. The coat itself was poorly maintained, the fur matted and stained, a testament to how far the once skilled hunters had fallen since joining Carson's gang. Nobody cheats the Carson gang. The few people on the street quickly disappeared into doorways and behind wagons. Even Hannah took a step back, though her hand tightened on the medicine bag at her hip. She'd seen too many of the gang's victims, had spent too many nights trying to patch up what their cruelty had wrought. The worst cases haunted her dreams, like old Jim Murphy, found half frozen in the snow after disrespecting the gang, or the Mason brothers who'd refused to pay protection money for their claim. "I didn't cheat," Daniel protested weakly, blood dripping from his split lip onto the pristine snow. "I swear on my mother's grave. Please, I've got a new baby at home." "You'll be joining her there," Ezra Blackwood laughed, drawing his knife. The blade caught the winter sunlight, its edge notched from frequent use. The younger Blackwood had always been the crueler of the cousins, taking a particular pleasure in making examples of those who crossed the gang. "Boss says we need to make an example. Can't have minors thinking they can take advantage of our hospitality." Nathan hadn't moved from his position by the trading post, but something had shifted in his stance. Hannah noticed his right hand had drifted closer to one of his throwing knives, while his left had casually adjusted his rifle sling. The movement was so subtle that most would have missed it, but she'd grown up watching trappers and hunters prepare for danger. More telling was how the snow around his feet remained unmarked. Even in preparation for violence, he moved with the same ghost-like precision that had earned him his nickname. "Let him go." The words were quiet, barely carrying across the snow-covered street, but they cut through the commotion like a blade through ice. Every head turned toward Nathan, who still hadn't moved from his spot. The temperature seemed to drop further, as if the coldness in his voice had somehow leached into the air itself. Well, Eli sneered, shoving Daniel aside to face this new challenge. The miner stumbled, but managed to stay upright, fear and confusion warring on his bloodied face. "Looks like we got ourselves a hero, brother, some trapper who thinks he can tell the Carson gang their business." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Not telling," Nathan replied softly, his breath barely misting in the frigid air. "Just making an observation, like how your knife works getting sloppy." His eyes flicked to the crude carvings they'd left on the saloon table. "Shows how you treated those wolf pelts too. Rushed job, messy. Makes me wonder what else you're getting careless about." The insult, subtle as it was, hit home. The Blackwood cousins had prided themselves on their reputation as skilled hunters before joining the Carson gang. They'd once been known throughout the territory for their tracking abilities and clean kills. Now they were little more than common thugs, and Nathan's words had exposed that truth for all to hear. "You got a death wish, trapper?" Ezra advanced, snow crunching under his boots. His hand tightened on his knife while Eli circled wide, trying to flank Nathan. Their movements were predictable, telegraphed, the sloppy footwork of men who'd forgotten the patience that true hunting required. Because that's what you're asking for, stepping into the Carson gang business. "If you're going to throw that knife," Nathan said quietly, his eyes on Ezra's grip, "you might want to adjust your hold. That angle, I'll send it wide right. Might hit the lady instead of me." He nodded toward Hannah, who still stood nearby, refusing to abandon the injured miner. Her father had taught her that running from evil only gave it more power. The casual observation, delivered in that same soft tone, caused both brothers to hesitate. It wasn't just the words. It was the absolute certainty behind them, the kind that only came from countless hours of practical experience. Nathan hadn't moved, hadn't drawn a weapon, but suddenly both Blackwoods were acutely aware of the throwing knives on his chest, worn with the same practical familiarity as their own poorly cured wolf pelts. The saloon doors swung open again, and Jake Butcher Carson himself emerged, drawn by the confrontation. The gang leader's massive frame filled the doorway, and his hand rested on the ivory-handled Colt at his hip. Steam rose from his breath into the cold air, and the boards creaked ominously beneath his weight. "Problems out here, boys?" "This trapper's interfering with business, boss," Eli reported, though he'd taken a small step back from Nathan. "Thinks he can tell us how to handle cheaters." Carson's eyes narrowed as he studied Nathan, taking in the careful stance, the well-worn weapons, the stillness that spoke of experience rather than fear. The gang leader had built his reputation on reading men, on knowing who would break and who would fight. Something about this trapper's glacial stare made him pause. "You got a name?" "Trapper?" "Some call me Ghost," Nathan replied softly, his glacial eyes meeting Carson's gaze. "On account of how I move through the high country. Though lately I've been thinking it might have more to do with how people tend to disappear around me when trouble starts." The threat was subtle, wrapped in that quiet voice like new snow covering old blood, but unmistakable. For a long moment, the only sound was the mountain wind whispering through the pines, carrying with it the promise of another storm. Hannah felt the tension in the air, thick as river ice, and wondered if this strange, quiet man might be the answer to the prayers of a community that had lived too long under the shadow of fear. Jake Carson's laughter shattered the tense silence, echoing off the snow-laden buildings of Pine Valley Basin. "Ghost, is it?" he drawled, his massive frame still blocking the saloon doorway. "Heard whispers about someone like you. They say there's a shadow moving through the high country, leaving behind dead outlaws from here to the Dakota Territory." His hand hadn't moved from his ivory-handled Colt. "Course, those were just campfire tales, ghost stories to scare the young ones." Hannah Wheeler watched the exchange carefully, noting how Nathan's stillness seemed to intensify rather than break. The last rays of sunlight caught the silver in his hair, making the scar on his face stand out like a frozen river against weathered stone. The few townsfolk still brave enough to watch did so from behind frosted windows or the corners of buildings, their breath fogging the glass as they witnessed what many suspected would be Pine Valley Basin's defining moment. "Stories," Nathan replied softly, "have a way of starting somewhere." His glacial eyes remained fixed on Carson, but his awareness seemed to encompass everything. The Blackwood cousins' shifting stances, the wounded miner Daniel's attempts to edge away, the crunch of snow beneath boots as Carson's men emerged from the saloon to back their leader. Old Thomas Wheeler appeared in the trading post's doorway, his weathered hands gripping a double-barrel shotgun. The trader's presence changed the dynamic subtly. He was respected in the settlement, even by the Carson gang, for his fair dealings and steady supply of ammunition. "Evening's getting cold," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his years. "Might be time for everyone to find somewhere warm." "Warm indeed," Carson smiled, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Matter of fact, I was just about to invite our new friend here to join us inside. Man called Ghost ought to have some interesting tales to share." He gestured toward the saloon's open door, where the lamplight spilled out onto the blood-stained snow. "What do you say, trapper? Care to warm yourself by our fire?" The invitation carried an edge sharp as a skinning knife. Nathan's response was equally measured. "Appreciate the offer, but I've found poor company makes even the warmest fire feel cold." Eli Blackwood's face reddened at the implied insult, his hand tightening on his knife. "You're awfully bold for a man-surrounded trapper. 5 of us out here, more inside, and you're standing there acting like—" "6, Nathan corrected quietly. "What?" "6 out here. Man by the corner of the mercantile with the sawed-off scattergun. Though from how he's holding it, I'd guess the right barrel's loaded shot left one empty." His eyes never left Carson's face. "Sloppy, like those wolf pelts you're wearing." The observation sent a ripple through the gathering. Hannah saw Carson's eyes narrow, recognizing that Nathan hadn't just been standing idle. He'd been reading the situation, cataloging threats, analyzing weaknesses. It was the careful assessment of a predator, not prey. "You've got sharp eyes, Ghost," Carson said, his jovial tone wearing thin. "Makes me wonder what else you've been noticing during your time in the high country, like those missing supply wagons up near Thunder Ridge, or those cattle rustlers who disappeared last month." The gang leader took a step forward, snow crunching under his heavy boots. Funny how trouble seems to follow you. Trouble was here before me, Nathan replied. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke along with the promise of more snow. Ask Miss Wheeler there how many folks she's had to patch up. Ask old Thomas how many traders stopped coming through because the trails got too dangerous. Way I see it, trouble's been mighty comfortable here for a while. Hannah felt the weight of the moment, heavy as an avalanche waiting to break. She'd seen too many good people broken by the Carson gang, too many lives shattered by their reign of terror. But something was different now. The gang's usual swagger had been replaced by a wary tension, like wolves encountering something they couldn't quite identify as prey or predator. "Careful, Trapper." Carson's voice dropped lower, matching Nathan's quiet tone. "Sounds almost like you're planning to stay a while. That wouldn't be wise. Pine Valley Basin has a way of being unkind to folks who don't understand how things work. Funny thing about the high country," Nathan responded, his breath barely visible in the cold air. "It's got its own rules. Doesn't care much for men who think they can claim it. I've seen what happens to those who try." His hand hadn't moved toward his weapons, but somehow that made his stillness more threatening. Nature's got a way of reminding folks that no matter how big the wolf, winter's always bigger. The metaphor wasn't lost on anyone present. Carson's face darkened, the pretense of hospitality falling away like snow from a laden branch. "That sounds mighty close to a threat, Ghost. Just another observation. Like how your men are getting nervous, spreading out too wide. Makes their crossfire dangerous." Nathan's voice remained soft as ever, but it carried to every corner of the suddenly silent street. "In weather like this, accidents happen easily. Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt by their own side's poor planning." The tension crackled like ice in a spring thaw. Hannah found herself holding her breath, watching as two kinds of predators measured each other in the fading mountain light. She'd seen confrontations before, but this was different. The Carson gang had always relied on brute force and fear, but they were facing something new. A quiet certainty that seemed as immovable as the mountains themselves. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky remained clear. Winter storms in the high country could appear without warning, and this one felt like an omen. Carson seemed to sense it too, something in Nathan's glacial stare making him reconsider his options. "Well, Ghost," he finally said, forcing a smile that looked more like a snarl. "Seems we've all given each other something to think about. Boys, let's get back inside where it's warm. Been a long day." The gang members began backing toward the saloon, their earlier bravado replaced by careful movements. Only the Blackwood cousins lingered, their matching wolf pelts stark against the white snow. "This ain't over," Eli muttered, but his threat sounded hollow in the gathering dusk. "No," Nathan agreed quietly. "It isn't." The words hung in the air like frost, a promise rather than a threat, as the day's last light painted the snow in shades of blood and shadow. As the Carson gang retreated into the Silver Pine Saloon, Hannah Wheeler moved quickly to help Daniel Cooper to his feet. The young miner's face was a mess of blood and bruises, but his eyes held a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. Nathan watched them for a moment, then retrieved his bundle of pelts from where they'd fallen during the confrontation. "My clinic's this way," Hannah said, supporting Daniel's weight. "You should come too, Mr. Ghost. Something tells me we have things to discuss." Her voice carried the same quiet strength that had made her father a pillar of the community. But there was something else there, a determination that matched the steel in her spine. The clinic occupied the back room of the Wheeler trading post, a warm space filled with dried herbs and medical supplies. The walls were lined with shelves holding everything from bandages to bone saws, each item meticulously organized. Through the frost-covered windows, they could see the saloon's lights casting long shadows across the snow as more of Carson's men arrived for the evening. "They'll be planning something now," Thomas Wheeler said, securing the trading post's heavy door. The old trader moved to stoke the pot-bellied stove, its warmth pushing back the mountain chill. Carson's not the type to let a challenge go unanswered. Nathan stood by the window, his stillness making him seem almost part of the shadows. "Planning's not their strength," he said softly. "They rely on fear and numbers. Take those away. You're left with angry men making mistakes." Hannah cleaned Daniel's wounds with practiced efficiency, her gentle hands belying the anger in her voice. "They've been getting worse these past months. Started with protection fees for the miners, then the trap lines. Now they're taking whole supply wagons, leaving folks to starve when winter hits hard." She paused, meeting Nathan's glacial gaze. "3 families didn't make it through last winter. We found them in their cabins come spring thaw." "The Marshall and Silver Creek's in their pocket," Thomas added, his weathered face grim. "And the territorial governor's too busy with Indian troubles to spare men for local disputes. Carson knows it. That's why he chose Pine Valley Basin. Isolated enough to control, rich enough to plunder. Like wolves picking off strays from the herd," Nathan observed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Except wolves kill from necessity. Men like Carson do it because they enjoy the power." Something in his tone made Hannah look up sharply from her work. "You've dealt with their kind before," she said, echoing her earlier observation. It wasn't a question this time. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something distant. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-earned experience. 5 years ago, up in the Dakota Territory, group calling themselves the Blackwood Brotherhood. Yeah. He nodded at Daniel's surprised look. Same Blackwoods, they were different then. Hunters, trackers, good at what they did until Carson found them. "What happened?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "Carson has a way of finding skilled men, turning them cruel. The Brotherhood started small, poaching, intimidation. Then they got bold. Took over a trading post near Fort Pierre, thinking they could control the river trade." Nathan's hand unconsciously touched the scar on his face. They didn't count on someone tracking them through the winter storms, following their trail, learning their patterns. By spring thaw, the Brotherhood was gone. Just disappeared into the blizzards. The implications hung in the air like frost. Hannah finished bandaging Daniel's face, her movements deliberate as she processed Nathan's words. And now they're here, stronger than ever. Carson's built himself a small army. "Numbers don't matter much in the high country," Nathan replied softly. "Weather, terrain, preparation, those make the difference between survival and death. Carson's men are fighters, but they're not mountain men. They don't respect the wilderness or its ways." Thomas Wheeler studied Nathan with shrewd eyes. "That's why you're really here, Ghost? Following their trail again?" Before Nathan could answer, the trading post's door opened, letting in a blast of cold air along with Sarah Cooper, Daniel's wife. She rushed to her husband's side, their infant daughter bundled against her chest. "Daniel, someone said the Carson gang." She stopped, taking in his battered face with horror. "I'm all right, love," Daniel managed a weak smile. "Thanks to Mr. Ghost here." He turned to Nathan, his voice strengthening. "They'd have killed me if you hadn't stepped in. I've got nothing to repay you with, but man shouldn't need payment for doing what's right." Nathan cut him off gently. His eyes lingered on the baby, something softening in his glacial gaze. "Take care of your family. That's enough payment." Hannah watched this exchange with growing interest. The quiet trapper was more than he appeared. His careful words and controlled movements spoke of training, of purpose. "You're not just passing through, are you?" she asked. "You knew they were here. You've been watching, waiting." Nathan's response was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, a large group by the sound of their hoofbeats on the packed snow. Thomas moved to the window, his expression darkening. "Carson sent riders out. Must be 15-20 men, heading up toward Thunder Ridge." "The supply wagon," Hannah realized with dawning horror. "The one from Silver Creek. It's due tomorrow with medicine and winter provisions. They're going to hit it in the past." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the stove and the baby's soft cooing. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of another storm. Nathan stood perfectly still, but something had changed in his bearing. Like a bow being drawn, power held in check but ready to release. "Without those supplies," Thomas said grimly, "half the settlement won't survive the winter. Carson knows that. He's forcing our hand." Nathan moved toward the door, his movements fluid and purposeful. "No," he said quietly, checking his rifle with practiced hands. "He's making his first mistake." The words hung in the air like smoke, a promise of things to come as the mountainite closed in around Pine Valley Basin. The storm hit Pine Valley Basin just before midnight, bringing with it a curtain of white that transformed the settlement into a world of shadows and swirling snow. Nathan stood in the trading post's workshop, the lamplight casting his shadow against walls lined with pelts and hunting equipment. Hannah watched as his practiced hands modified a set of snowshoes with a series of subtle alterations she'd never seen before. "The technique's Arapaho," he explained softly, noticing her interest. "Let you move silently even on crusty snow. They call it ghost walking." His fingers worked the rawhide with practiced efficiency. "Carson's men won't know to look for the signs, especially in a storm like this." Thomas Wheeler entered, shaking snow from his coat. "Riders came back from Thunder Ridge," he reported, his voice grim. "Carson's got men positioned all along the supply route. They're not even trying to hide their intentions anymore." He placed a rough map on the workbench, its edges curling with age and use. "The wagon has to come through Devil's Throat. There's no other way with this much snow." Nathan studied the map, his glacial eyes taking in every detail. Devil's Throat was a narrow pass through the mountains, barely wide enough for a wagon and treacherous in the best conditions. In a storm like this, with Carson's men waiting, it would be a death trap. "They're expecting a direct confrontation," he said quietly, tracing the route with a scarred finger. 20 men, probably split between the high ground here and here. He marked 2 spots on the map. "They'll wait until the wagon's fully committed to the pass, then box it in. Standard ambush tactics." "Standard except for the weather," Hannah added, moving closer to study the map. Growing up in the high country had taught her to read terrain as easily as she read her medical texts. This storm's not natural for this time of year. It's a snow eater, the kind that can strip a man to bone if he's caught unprepared. A ghost of a smile touched Nathan's lips. "Nature doesn't take sides," he murmured. "But she does punish those who don't respect her." He turned to Thomas. "I'll need everything you have on Carson's movements over the past month. Places they've camped, trails they've used, any patterns." The old trader nodded toward his office. "Been keeping track since they first showed up. Didn't know why at the time, it just felt important." He paused, studying Nathan with shrewd eyes. "You're not planning to take them head on, are you? Even with your reputation, 20 to 1 ain't odds I'd bet on." "The wolf doesn't fight the whole pack," Nathan replied, returning to his work on the snowshoes. "He separates them, uses terrain and weather, and makes them fight on his terms." His hands never stopped moving as he spoke, each modification precise and purposeful. "Carson's men are used to being the predators. They've forgotten what it's like to be hunted." Hannah watched his preparations with growing understanding. Every piece of equipment he modified told a story. The specialized bindings on the snowshoes, the way he'd adjusted his rifle sling for silent carrying, even how he'd rewrapped the handles of his throwing knives for better grip in the extreme cold. This wasn't just a man preparing for a fight. This was a craftsman preparing for a hunt. "You've done this before," she said softly. "Not just tracked men through storms, but this. Making them disappear without a trace." Nathan's hands stilled for a moment, his eyes distant. "After the war, I served with a special unit. We tracked deserters through the Dakota Territory, men who'd turned outlaw, preying on isolated settlements." His voice carried the weight of dark memories. "Learned that the loudest men often die the quietest deaths, especially in winter storms. The workshop door opened again, admitting Daniel Cooper along with several other miners and trappers. Despite his injuries, determination showed in every line of his face. "Word's spreading about what Carson's planning," he said. "We've got men willing to fight if you'll lead them." Nathan shook his head, never looking up from his work. "This isn't a battle to be won with numbers. Storm like this, large groups are just targets waiting to be picked off." He tested the edge of a modified hunting knife. Its blade darkened to prevent reflection. "What I need is information. Eyes and ears in the settlement while I work the high ground." The miners exchanged glances, clearly wanting to do more than just gather intelligence. Hannah understood their frustration. They'd lived under Carson's boot for too long, watched too many friends suffer. But she also saw the wisdom in Nathan's approach. In the high country, patience and preparation often meant the difference between life and death. "There's something else you should know," Thomas said, his voice heavy with concern. "Marshall's finally responded to our messages. Says he's sending deputies." He trailed off meaningfully. "But they're Carson's men," Nathan finished quietly. "Expected that. He'll want witnesses to what happens here. His version of events, told by his people." He began laying out his modified equipment with methodical precision. "Which means we're working against two deadlines now, the storm and the law." Hannah moved to help him sort through medical supplies, choosing items that could be easily carried and used in extreme conditions. "How long do you think we have?" "Storm this severe will last 3 days at most. Marshall's men won't risk the high passes until it clears." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw past the glacial calm to something harder, more resolved. "By then, it'll be finished one way or another." Outside, the wind howled through Pine Valley Basin like a hungry wolf, drowning out the sounds from the saloon where Carson's men drank and plotted. But in the trading post's workshop, in the warm lamplight, Hannah watched a different kind of predator prepare for the hunt. Nathan's quiet efficiency spoke of a confidence born from experience, each movement deliberate and purposeful as he readied himself for what was to come. The storm roared beyond the walls, but within, the only sound was the soft scrape of steel on leather and the whispered plans of those who had finally found the courage to stand against the coming dark. The storm transformed Thunder Ridge into a realm of howling winds and stinging ice, where visibility dropped to arm's length and the temperature fell low enough to freeze breath mid-air. In these conditions, most men would seek shelter, huddle near fires, and wait for nature's fury to pass. But Nathan moved through the whiteout like a spirit, his modified snowshoes leaving tracks that the wind erased almost instantly. He'd left Pine Valley Basin 2 hours before dawn, timing his departure between the Carson gang's patrol shifts. The storm worked in his favor, its fury masking his movement while amplifying every mistake made by those unused to winter's harshest moods. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the glow of several campfires, Carson's men attempting to stay warm, each flame a beacon announcing their positions. "Amateurs," he whispered, his voice lost in the wind. They'd positioned their sentries on the high ground, a textbook military tactic that ignored the realities of mountain weather. Up there, the wind would cut through any clothing, numbing fingers and clouding judgment. Within hours, the cold would force them to rotate positions frequently, creating patterns he could exploit. Behind him, Pine Valley Basin had disappeared into the storm, but he carried a clear image of Hannah's last words in his mind. "The supply wagon won't wait forever. The driver, Michael Reeves, is an old friend. He'll hold at Broken Spoke Ranch until noon tomorrow, but after that, he'll have to risk the pass. Those medicines can't freeze." The information had solidified his strategy. He wasn't just fighting Carson's men. He was racing against time, weather, and human necessity. The hunt would have to be precise, methodical, and above all, quiet. Moving like smoke through the trees, Nathan approached the first campfire. 3 men huddled around the flames, their wolf fur coats crusted with ice. He recognized them as part of Carson's newer recruits, men drawn by promises of easy money and power. Their rifles leaned against a nearby pine out of immediate reach, another amateur mistake. "Swear this storm's unnatural," one man grumbled, pulling his coat tighter. Ain't never seen one blow up so fierce, so fast. Boss says we hold position, another replied through chattering teeth. That trapper ghost's bound to try something, storm or no storm. The third man spat into the snow. Ghost? He's just another man. 20 of us, one of him. Ain't nothing supernatural about those odds. Nathan moved closer, using the wind's howl to mask his approach. The men's focus on the fire had ruined their night vision, leaving them blind to anything beyond the circle of wavering light. Their conversation carried to him in fragments broken by the storm's fury. Heard stories, though, up in Dakota territory. The whole gang disappeared. Just tales to scare. Their fear was palpable, carried on their voices and in their restless movements. Good. Fear made men hurry, made them careless, made them bunch together instead of watching the darkness. Moving with the practiced silence that had earned him his name, Nathan circled the camp. Their horses, poorly protected from the wind, stood miserable and stamping in a makeshift corral. A seasoned mountain man would have known better. Horses needed proper shelter in weather like this, or they'd be useless when needed. With movements as natural as breathing, Nathan drew one of his modified throwing knives. The blade was perfectly balanced, its edge honed to razor sharpness, and darkened to prevent any telltale glint. The men's conversation continued, unaware of death's quiet approach. Boss wants us to make an example when that wagon comes through. Show everyone what happens when... The sentence ended in a startled gasp as Nathan's knife found its mark, severing the lead rope of their horses. The frightened animals, already spooked by the storm, needed little encouragement to bolt. The sudden movement sent snow cascading from nearby branches, and in the confusion, Nathan's second knife cut through their rifles' slings, sending the weapons tumbling into the deep powder. "The horses!" one man shouted, all three scrambling to their feet. "Get them before they—" But the animals had already disappeared into the storm, leaving the men with a choice: pursue their mounts or maintain their position. Either way, they'd be forced to move, to leave the fire's warmth and stumble through the blizzard. "Can't let 'em get away," the leader decided, desperation clear in his voice. "Carson's skin is alive if we lose those horses. Split up, find their tracks before the storm covers them." Nathan watched from the shadows as the men separated, each following a different direction into the whiteout. Their movements were panicked, uncoordinated, everything a man shouldn't be in weather like this. Within minutes, their shouts to each other grew fainter, more distant, as the storm pulled them further apart. He gave them 30 minutes. In this weather, that was all it would take. When men got lost in a mountain storm, they made predictable choices. They'd seek shelter, try to circle back to their last known position. But in doing so, they'd only become more disoriented, more desperate. By the time he returned to their abandoned campfire, the wind had already begun to erase their tracks. The flames had died to embers, and their discarded rifles lay half buried in the snow. Nathan retrieved his throwing knives, wiped them clean, and continued his hunt. 3 men were eliminated from Carson's force without a single shot fired. Not dead. The storm probably wouldn't kill them. They'd eventually stumble onto a ranch or mining camp, miles from Pine Valley Basin, with a story about getting lost in the blizzard. A common enough tale in the high country. But more importantly, word would spread back to Carson. 3 men gone, vanished into the white, their disappearance as silent as a ghost's passing. The myth would grow, and with it, the fear. In weather like this, imagination was a weapon as potent as any rifle. Moving like a shadow through the storm, Nathan headed toward the next campfire's glow. The hunt was just beginning, and the night was still young. Somewhere out there, Carson's men waited, unknowing prey for a predator who had learned his craft from the wilderness itself. Dawn brought no relief to Thunder Ridge. If anything, the storm had intensified, turning the mountain passes into a maze of white-walled fury. In the remains of Carson's largest camp, Eli Blackwood paced through knee-deep snow, his wolf fur coat heavy with ice. 3 more men had gone missing during the night, vanishing between guard rotations as silently as the first group. "It ain't natural," Ezra muttered, feeding branches into their struggling fire. The younger Blackwood's usual bravado had given way to nervous glances at the swirling walls of white around them. 6 men don't just disappear. Not without a sound, not without tracks. A gust of wind howled through the camp, carrying with it a sound that might have been a rifle's action cycling, or might have been just the storm's voice. Every man's hand went to their weapon, eyes straining against the whiteness. The fear was palpable now, spreading through Carson's men like frostbite. "Ghost," someone whispered, the word barely audible above the wind. "They say he learned hunting from the Arapaho, learned to move through storms like a spirit." "Shut up," Eli snapped, but his voice cracked slightly. He'd seen the signs around the abandoned camps. Supplies arranged too neatly, weapons missing but no blood, horses gone but no struggle. Whatever was hunting them knew its business, knew how to let nature do the killing. "He's just a man, a trapper who got lucky." Back in Pine Valley Basin, Hannah Wheeler worked in her clinic, preparing medical supplies for what she knew would come. The trading post had become a quiet center of resistance, with Thomas coordinating a network of lookouts and message runners. Through the frost-covered windows, she could see Carson himself pacing the length of the Silver Pine Saloon's porch, his massive frame casting long shadows in the stormy light. "3 more riders just came in," Daniel Cooper reported, stamping snow from his boots as he entered. His face was still bruised, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Said they found tracks up near Eagle's Rest, big circles in the snow like something was hunting them. Carson pulled his men back closer to the pass." Hannah nodded, sorting through her herbs and bandages. "He's consolidating his forces. Nathan predicted this. Said Carson would fall back on his military training when things started going wrong." She paused, remembering the quiet trapper's words from the night before. Said that's when they'd be most vulnerable. "How's that?" Daniel asked, helping her pack the supplies into easily carried bags. "Because they'll bunch together, try to create a strong defensive position. But up there, in weather like this?" She gestured toward the window, where the storm raged unabated. "Numbers just mean more targets, more men to feed and keep warm, more chances for fear to spread." The trading post's door opened again, admitting Sarah Cooper with her baby bundled against her chest. "Carson sent riders to Silver Creek," she reported softly. "Overheard them talking. They're calling in reinforcements." Thomas Wheeler emerged from his office, his weathered face grim. "Won't matter, storm's closed every pass between here and there, nobody's getting through until it breaks." He studied the swirling snow outside. "Nature's on our side for once." Back on Thunder Ridge, Nathan moved like a phantom through the white maze of pine and granite. The storm had become his ally, its fury masking his movement while amplifying every mistake made by his prey. He'd spent the night methodically isolating and eliminating Carson's outriders, using their own fear and discomfort against them. The gang leader's military background was shown in his response, pulling his men back, establishing a defensive perimeter around Devil's Throat Pass. It was textbook strategy, exactly what Nathan had anticipated. Carson was fighting the last war, applying battlefield tactics to a hunting ground. Through the swirling snow, Nathan caught movement. 2 men struggling through a drift, their rifles slung awkwardly across their backs. Their voices carried to him in fragments. "Swear I heard something? Just the wind? Shouldn't have split up?" He recognized them as the Hanson brothers, former cavalry scouts turned outlaws. They were better woodsmen than most of Carson's men, which made them more dangerous and more necessary to remove from the equation. Moving like smoke through the trees, Nathan positioned himself ahead of their path. The brothers were following a natural line through the terrain, taking the easiest route back to the main camp. Predictable. Military training made men think in straight lines, direct routes. Nature preferred curves, patience. He'd prepared this spot an hour earlier, subtly marking certain trees, calculating angles. Now, As the Hansons approached, he put his plan into action. A carefully thrown knife caught the lowest branch of a snow-laden pine, sending a cascade of white powder down just behind them. The men spun, rifles coming up, firing blindly into the storm. The shots echoed off the mountain walls, multiplied by the wind into a chorus of phantom gunfire. More snow fell from other branches, creating the illusion of movement on all sides. "We're surrounded!" the younger Hanson shouted, panic evident in his voice. "Shut up and think," his brother responded, but fear had already taken hold. They began firing at shadows, each muzzle flash ruining their night vision, each echoing report increasing their terror. Nathan watched, silent and still, as the brothers' disciplined training dissolved into primal fear. When their rifles ran dry, they did exactly what he'd predicted. They ran, separating in their panic, each convinced they were being hunted by multiple attackers. The storm would do the rest. They'd survive, probably find their way down to one of the lower valleys, but they'd carry stories of phantom attackers and impossible ambushes. The legend would grow, spreading through Carson's ranks like a virus. In Pine Valley Basin, the sound of distant gunfire reached Hannah's ears. She paused in her work, sharing a knowing look with her father. The shots echoed strangely through the storm, making it impossible to count individual reports or determine exact locations. But she understood what they meant. The hunt was continuing, and somewhere up there in the white fury of Thunder Ridge, a ghost was teaching Carson's army the true meaning of fear. Raycomb Butcher. Carson stood at the window of the Silver Pine Saloon, watching ice crystals form patterns on the glass like frostwork premonitions. The storm's fury had turned noon into twilight, and his remaining men huddled in corners, jumping at every sound the wind made as it howled through Pine Valley Basin's streets. 10 men, he growled, his breath fogging the glass. 10 of our best. Gone without a trace. His massive fist crashed down on a nearby table, sending whiskey bottles rattling. And not one body was found. Not one. The Blackwood cousins exchanged nervous glances from their position near the bar. They'd seen Carson angry before, seen him violent, but this was different. This was the rage of a man watching his control slip away like snow through fingers. "Could have just got lost in the storm, boss," Eli suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Weather like this, men get turned around easily." Carson turned, his eyes blazing. Lost? The Hanson brothers were scouts during the war. They could track a hawk's shadow across the prairie. And now, they're just gone. He stalked across the room, his heavy boots making the floorboards creak. "Number, this is him. This is Ghost." Outside, the wind changed direction, sending a blast of snow against the saloon's windows. Several men flinched at the sound, hands moving to weapons before realizing it was just the storm. Fear had worked its way deep into Carson's gang, spreading through their ranks like poison. "We still hold the high ground," Ezra Blackwood said, trying to sound confident. "Got men watching every approach to Devil's Throat. Wagons gotta come through there, ain't no other way with this much snow." Carson's laugh was harsh as broken glass. "High ground? You think that matters to him? Look at them." He gestured to his men, once fierce outlaws now huddled like sheep in a storm. "He's hunting us, using the weather, the terrain, making us jump at shadows until we're too scared to think straight." At that moment, Thomas Wheeler's teenage son burst into the saloon, snow swirling around him as he stamped his feet. "Message from Broken Spoke Ranch," he announced, his young voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Wagons leaving at noon tomorrow, storm or no storm. Medicine can't wait any longer." Carson snatched the message from the boy's hand, reading it quickly before crumpling it in his fist. For a moment, something like uncertainty crossed his face, an expression his men had never seen before. Then his features hardened into a mask of determination. "Get word to the men at Devil's Throat," he ordered. "Pull them back closer to the pass. I want everyone within supporting distance, no more solo posts, no more small groups." His voice rose, carrying to every corner of the saloon. "Ghost wants to hunt? Fine. Let's give him a proper army to hunt." As the Blackwoods hurried to relay the orders, Carson turned back to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could see Hannah Wheeler moving between buildings, carrying her medical bag. The sight of her calm efficiency made his jaw clench. The town's quiet resistance was another thorn in his side, another reminder that his grip on Pine Valley Basin was slipping. Up on Thunder Ridge, Nathan watched Carson's men abandon their outer positions through the specialized scope he'd mounted on his Hawken rifle. The gang's movements told him everything he needed to know about their state of mind. Hurried, bunched together, jumping at every sound the storm made. Running scared, he whispered to himself, his breath barely visible in the frigid air. The snow had buried the landscape under 3 feet of white, transforming familiar terrain into an alien wilderness. But Nathan moved through it like a spirit, reading subtle signs that others would miss. A bent branch here, a snow pattern there, each one telling him a story of his prey's movements. He'd spent the morning laying false trails, creating phantom tracks that seemed to circle Carson's positions. The sight of those tracks, appearing and disappearing as if their maker could walk through solid snow, had done more damage to gang morale than any direct attack could have. Making his way back down toward Pine Valley Basin, Nathan spotted something that made him pause. Fresh tracks leading away from the main group, made by someone who knew how to move in deep snow. Following them carefully, he found himself approaching a hidden overlook with a clear view of the settlement below. There, partially concealed behind a snow-laden pine, crouched one of Carson's men, but not just any man. Nathan recognized him as James Preacher Mackenzie, Carson's chief strategist and the one person in the gang who might understand the psychological warfare being waged against them. The man was making careful notes in a small book, documenting positions and movements in the town below. More importantly, he was watching the trading post with particular interest, noting the comings and goings that centered around that building. Nathan considered his options. Preacher was dangerous not for his gun hand but for his mind. If he'd figured out that the trading post was being used as a command center of sorts, it could change the entire dynamic of the conflict. Moving silent as death through the deep snow, Nathan closed the distance. Preacher was good. He'd chosen his position well, maintained proper sight lines, even set up small markers to warn of anyone approaching along obvious routes. But he'd never faced someone who'd learned to hunt from the wilderness itself. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the promise of even heavier snow to come. Nature herself seemed to be choosing sides in this conflict, providing cover for some while hindering others. Nathan allowed himself a ghost of a smile as he prepared to eliminate another piece from Carson's increasingly desperate game. In Pine Valley Basin, Hannah Wheeler felt the change in the wind and looked up toward the Thunder Ridge. Though the storm hid everything beyond the nearest buildings, she knew what was happening up there in the white fury. A hunter was stalking his prey, using their own fear as a weapon against them. She only hoped he could finish his work before the supply wagon forced everyone's hand. The morning would bring either salvation or bloodshed to Pine Valley Basin, and the storm's fury would determine which path they'd follow. Preacher never heard the death approach. One moment he was making careful notes about the trading post's activities, the next a hand like iron clamped over his mouth while a razor-sharp blade pressed against his throat. The falling snow had completely masked his attacker's approach, making the assault seem to materialize from the storm itself. "Keep still," Nathan's voice whispered, soft as falling snow. "Wouldn't want that book of yours to get lost in the weather." The blade pressed just enough to emphasize his point without breaking skin. "You've been watching the town, learning things. Question is, what do you plan to do with that knowledge?" Preacher was different from Carson's other men. Nathan had recognized that from the start. A former seminary student turned outlaw, he'd maintained in scholar's eye for detail and pattern that made him particularly dangerous. Now, pinned in the snow by an opponent he hadn't even heard coming, that analytical mind was already working the angles. "You could have killed me already," Preacher said carefully, his words measured despite his precarious position. "The fact that we're having this conversation means you want something." Nathan's grip didn't waver. "Smart man. That's why Carson keeps you around. You see the bigger picture." Through the swirling snow, The lights of Pine Valley Basin flickered like distant stars. "Tell me what you figured out." "Trade you," Preacher offered, his tone almost professorial despite the blade at his throat. "Information for information. You want to know what I've learned? I want to know how you do it. How you move through this storm like a spirit, how you make men vanish without a trace." A ghost of a smile touched Nathan's lips, though the preacher couldn't see it. "You've studied military strategy. Tell me what you see happening here." "Psychological warfare," Preacher replied promptly. "You're not just eliminating men, you're breaking their will to fight. Every disappearance, every mysterious track in the snow, it all feeds the legend. The men are starting to believe you're supernatural, a vengeful spirit rather than just a skilled hunter." He paused thoughtfully. "But that's not the whole story, is it? Go on." "The trading post is your command center. The Wheeler girl and her father are coordinating something. An information network, probably, using the town's natural relationships to track our movements. But Carson's too focused on the obvious threat to see the subtle one." Preacher's analytical tone took on a note of admiration. "You're not just hunting us. You're orchestrating a complete collapse of our control." Down in Pine Valley Basin, Hannah worked by lamplight in the clinic, organizing supplies while listening to the latest reports. Sarah Cooper had proven to have a talent for gathering intelligence, her young mother's status making her seemingly invisible to Carson's men as she moved about the settlement. "They're getting desperate," Sarah reported, her baby sleeping peacefully against her chest. "Heard two of them talking about making a run for it, storm or no storm. They're saying Ghost isn't human, that he can walk through solid snow and appear out of nowhere." Thomas Wheeler nodded grimly, marking positions on his map. "Fear's doing half the work for us. Nathan said it would, said men who rely on brute force don't know how to handle an enemy they can't fight directly." Back on the ridge, Nathan listened as Preacher continued his analysis. The man's insights were sharp, dangerous. He saw the patterns that others missed, understood the psychological game being played. That made him both valuable and lethal. "You've studied the territory too," the Preacher observed. "Know every trail, every hollow. Probably spent weeks planning this before you ever showed yourself in town." His academic tone carried a hint of respect. "The storm isn't an obstacle for you, it's a weapon, as much as your rifle or those throwing knives." "You understand strategy," Nathan acknowledged softly. "So you know what happens next." "Carson won't retreat," Preacher said with certainty. "His pride won't let him. When that supply wagon comes through tomorrow, he'll throw everything we have left at securing it. It's not about profit anymore. It's about proving he can't be beaten, not by one man, not by nature herself." "And what do you think his chances are?" Preacher was quiet for a moment, considering. "Mathematically, we still have superior numbers. Tactically, you've already won. The men are broken, jumping at shadows. Carson's leadership is compromised by pride and anger. Even if we take the wagon, the cost will destroy what's left of the gang's cohesion." "A scholar's analysis," Nathan commented. "Cold, logical, but you've missed something crucial." "What's that?" "The human element. The townspeople aren't just pawns in this game. Their lives, their futures, they matter. Carson never understood that. To him, they were just resources to be exploited." The blade pressed a fraction harder. "The question is, what do they mean to you?" In the silence that followed, the wind seemed to hold its breath. Preacher's analytical mind worked through the implications, understanding dawning in his voice. "You're offering me a choice." "Smart man," Nathan repeated softly. "Carson's finished, whether he knows it or not. But knowledge like yours, understanding like yours, that could help a lot of people. Or it could get them killed. Your decision." The storm swirled around them, erasing tracks and muffling sounds, as Preacher made the choice that would determine his fate. In Pine Valley Basin, Hannah looked up toward Thunder Ridge, feeling the subtle shift in the wind that preceded a change in weather. Whatever was happening up there in the white fury would shape the coming confrontation. The night deepened, carrying with it the weight of decisions made and paths chosen as the storm continued its relentless transformation of the world into a realm of white silence and deadly beauty. The decision crystallized in Preacher's mind like frost on a window pane, patterns forming from seemingly random elements into a clear picture. Carson was never going to stop with Pine Valley Basin, he said quietly, his breath visible in the frigid air. He's been talking about expanding, taking control of all the mountain settlements, creating an empire. And now? Nathan's blade remained steady at the strategist's throat, but his tone invited continuation. Now I understand what you meant about the human element. Preacher's analytical voice took on a note of revelation. I've been studying patterns, movements, strategies, treating it all like a military campaign. But that's not what this is it? This is about people, about choices. The wind howled around them, carrying ice crystals that stung like tiny needles. Nathan waited, patient as the wilderness itself, while Preacher worked through his thoughts. My notebook, the former seminary student finally said. It's not just observations about the trading post. I've documented everything: Carson's plans, supply caches, contact networks with corrupt officials, names, dates, locations. Everything you'd need to dismantle not just his operation here, but his entire organization. Nathan was silent for a long moment, evaluating. The blade didn't waver, but something shifted in his stance. Why keep records that detailed? Insurance initially, Preacher admitted. Information is power, but also habit, I suppose. Even when I left the seminary, I couldn't stop analyzing, documenting, trying to understand the patterns in things. He gave a small, bitter laugh. Ironic that my search for understanding led me to serve a man who understands nothing but force. Down in Pine Valley Basin, Carson paced the length of the Silver Pine Saloon like a caged bear, his agitation growing with each passing hour. Where the hell is Preacher? He demanded, causing several men to flinch at his tone. He should have reported back by now. The Blackwood cousins exchanged uneasy glances. Storm's getting worse, Eli offered. Maybe he's waiting it out somewhere. Or maybe, Carson snarled, your ghost friend got to him too. He slammed his fist into a wall, making the whole building shudder. First light tomorrow, we move everything to Devil's Throat. Every man, every weapon. I want that pass locked down tight before the wagon comes through. But boss, Ezra protested weakly. Splitting our forces is what got us in trouble in the first place. If we leave the town unwatched... The town? Carson's laugh was ugly. The town's nothing. Bunch of shopkeepers and miners. Once we control that wagon, they'll fall in line or starve. Simple as that. Back on the ridge, Nathan had come to a decision. The blade disappeared from Preacher's throat as quickly and silently as it had appeared. Show me the notebook, he said softly. Preacher reached into his coat slowly, producing a leather-bound volume filled with precise handwriting. Everything's there, but there's something else you should know. He turned carefully to face Nathan, showing empty hands. Carson's got a fallback plan. If the wagon falls into enemy hands, his men are ordered to burn Pine Valley Basin to the ground. He's got firebombs planted throughout the settlement. Nathan's winter-cold eyes narrowed slightly. Where? That's the clever part. He only told each man about one location. No single person knows them all. Preacher tapped his notebook. Except me. I mapped them when they were being placed. 15 devices total, positioned to create a firestorm that would trap people in their homes. In the trading post's back room, Hannah worked by lamplight, preparing medical supplies while listening to Sarah Cooper's latest intelligence. Carson's men are scared, but getting desperate, the young mother reported. They're talking about making examples, about how no one defies the Carson gang without consequences. Thomas Wheeler studied his map grimly. Nathan said this would be the most dangerous time when they're afraid enough to be unpredictable but not broken enough to run. "We should warn people," Hannah said, but her father shook his head. "Too risky. If Carson suspects the town is preparing for something—" He was interrupted by a soft knock at the back door, a specific pattern they'd established for trusted contacts. When they opened it, they found a snow-covered figure standing there, holding a leather-bound notebook. "My name is James Mackenzie," he said quietly, "but most know me as Preacher. I believe I have the information you need." Hannah's hand moved toward the rifle by the door, but the man made no threatening moves. "Nathan sent me," he continued. "Said to tell you that winter's always bigger than the wolf. He said you'd understand." Back on Thunder Ridge, Nathan moved through the storm like a ghost, working his way toward Devil's Throat Pass. Preacher's information had changed the game. The threat wasn't just Carson's men now, but hidden bombs that could destroy everything he'd been fighting to protect. The wind carried the sound of movement ahead, Carson's men consolidating their position, preparing for what they thought would be their moment of triumph. They had numbers, weapons, and desperation on their side. But Nathan had something more valuable: knowledge. He checked his modified weapons with practiced efficiency, each movement precise despite the numbing cold. The confrontation was coming, as inevitable as the dawn. But now the stakes were even higher than before. It wasn't just about breaking Carson's power. It was about preventing a massacre. The storm showed no signs of weakening, its fury matching the tension building in the mountains. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction to Pine Valley Basin, and the difference would depend on a ghost's ability to turn Carson's own plans against him. The trading post's back room had become a war council of sorts, with Preacher's notebook open on the central table. Hannah held a lantern over the pages while her father and Daniel Cooper studied the precisely drawn maps showing the locations of Carson's firebombs. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Pine Valley Basin, as if nature herself was trying to bury the settlement's dark secrets under a blanket of white. 15 devices, Thomas Wheeler muttered, his weathered finger tracing the marked locations. "Strategically placed to create a firestorm. The man's a butcher, but he knows his business." "The devices are simple but effective," Preacher explained, his academic tone at odds with the devastating information he conveyed. "Glass bottles filled with coal oil and phosphorus wrapped in wet rawhide. When the rawhide dries and shrinks in a fire, it breaks the glass, spreading the flames exponentially." "Like a prairie fire in the sky," Daniel said softly, remembering similar horrors from the war. "Once it starts, the heat creates its own wind, feeding itself until nothing's left." Hannah's mind was already working through the implications. "We need to evacuate the Pakitan." "No." The Preacher interrupted gently. "Carson's men are watching for any unusual movement. A mass evacuation would trigger them to detonate the devices immediately." He tapped one of his careful drawings. "Our best chance is to remove them quietly, one by one, under cover of normal activities." Up in the storm-racked peaks near Devil's Throat, Nathan ghosted between the trees, taking stock of Carson's defensive positions. The gang leader had concentrated his remaining forces around the pass, creating a gauntlet that the supply wagon would have to run. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an impregnable position. But these weren't normal circumstances. The wind shifted slightly, carrying voices to his position. "Swear I saw something move." "It's just the snow, damn it. Keep your nerve." "Easy for you to say. You weren't there when the Hanson brothers disappeared." Nathan allowed himself a grim smile. Fear had done its work well. Carson's men were bunched together, seeking safety in numbers, but actually making themselves more vulnerable. Their tightly packed positions would work against them when the time came. Back in the settlement, Sarah Cooper moved through the shadowy streets with her baby, seemingly just a young mother checking on neighbors. But each stop was carefully planned, each conversation carrying coded warnings to the trusted network of residents who would help disable Carson's deadly insurance policy. "Remember," Preacher had instructed, "the rawhide wrapping is the key. Cut it carefully and the device can be disarmed. But one wrong move." He didn't need to finish the thought. The notebook had revealed more than just the bomb's locations. It detailed Carson's entire operation: supply routes, corrupt officials, hidden caches. The gang leader had built his empire on a foundation of carefully documented information, never suspecting that his trusted strategist was actually creating a blueprint for its destruction. "Nathan needs to know about the changes in Carson's positions," Hannah said, studying the latest markings on their map. The gang's consolidation around Devil's Throat had created new challenges, but also new opportunities. "He already does," Preacher replied with quiet certainty. "That's why he sent me here, not just to warn you about the bombs, but to coordinate the timing." He pointed to specific locations on the map. "Carson's pulled everyone back to the past, leaving the settlement vulnerable, but he's also left us a window to disable his failsafe before the wagon arrives." Thomas Wheeler's expression was grim. "How long?" "The wagon leaves Broken Spoke Ranch at noon. Given the weather and trail conditions, it'll reach Devil's Throat around 3. That gives us—" Preacher checked his pocket watch. "Just over 8 hours to find and disarm 15 bombs while maintaining the appearance of normal activity." "And if we miss even one?" Daniel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then Carson gets his revenge, whether he wins or loses at the pass." Preacher's academic demeanor cracked slightly, showing the weight of his responsibility. "I helped create this threat. Let me help eliminate it." Outside, the wind howled with increased fury, as if reflecting the growing tension in the settlement. Through the frosted windows, they could see the lights of the Silver Pine Saloon where Carson's remaining men drank and waited, unknowing that their deadliest weapons were being systematically neutralized. Nathan worked his way closer to Devil's Throat, using the storm's cover to study the gang's defenses. Carson had positioned men in layers, shooters on the high ground, blockers on the trail itself, all arranged to create a killing zone in the narrowest part of the pass. It was a solid military strategy, exactly what Nathan had expected from a man who thought in terms of battles rather than hunts. But battles weren't won by force alone. As he watched Carson's men huddle against the bitter cold, stamping their feet and blowing on numbed hands, Nathan saw the flaws in their leader's plan. They were fighting the environment as much as any human enemy, and the environment was winning. The storm was his ally, the wind his scout, the snow his concealment. While Carson prepared for a frontal assault, Nathan was setting up a hunt. And like any good hunter, he knew that the key to taking dangerous prey was to let them think they were the predator right up until the moment they realized they were being stalked. Dawn was still hours away, but the next phase of the confrontation had already begun. In Pine Valley Basin, trusted residents moved quietly through the night, disarming hidden bombs with trembling but determined hands. And up in the white fury of Thunder Ridge, a ghost prepared to teach Carson's army one final devastating lesson about the true nature of power in the high country. The hours before dawn became a deadly game of chess played in the storm's fury. Sarah Cooper found the first bomb hidden in the rafters of the livery stable, carefully concealed above a stack of dry hay. Her hands trembled as she followed Preacher's instructions, delicately cutting the wet rawhide without disturbing the glass container within. One slip, one wrong move, and half the settlement would go up in flames. "Easy now," Thomas Wheeler whispered, holding the lantern steady. "Just like he showed us." They worked in pairs, one to disarm, one to keep watch, moving through the settlement like ghosts in the swirling snow. The second device was tucked behind the church altar, a particularly cruel placement that made even Preacher's academic composure crack slightly. "Carson's mind works in symbols," he explained as Daniel Cooper carefully extracted the bomb. "He doesn't just want to destroy the settlement physically, he wants to break its spirit." Hannah coordinated the operation from the trading post, using her medical rounds as cover to pass messages between the teams. Each disarmed device was brought to a secure storage room, where Preacher documented their construction for future reference. 5 bombs were neutralized in the first 2 hours, then 8, then 10. But time was running out. Up in Devil's Throat Pass, Nathan's hunt had entered a new phase. Using techniques learned from years in the wilderness, he began manipulating Carson's defensive positions without ever revealing himself. A carefully placed shot would send snow cascading down one slope, forcing men to relocate. A thrown knife would reflect moonlight like a ghost's eyes, drawing nervous attention away from critical positions. There! By that stand of pines. A jumpy sentry fired into the darkness, his shot echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. "Hold your fire, damn it!" Eli Blackwood's voice carried over the wind. "You're wasting ammunition." But the damage was done. Each false alarm, each wasted shot, each moment of panic slowly degraded the gang's defensive coherence. Nathan watched through his scope as Carson's carefully planned positions began to shift and bunch, the men unconsciously drawing closer together for protection against the unseen threat. Back in Pine Valley Basin, Hannah finished treating Mrs. Anderson's arthritic hands, a legitimate medical call that also allowed her to check another location marked in Preacher's notebook. 12 bombs disabled now. 3 remained, and the night was growing old. "Something's happening up at the saloon," Sarah reported, slipping into the trading post's back room. Her baby slept peacefully against her chest, unaware of the deadly game being played around him. Carson's calling his lieutenants together. They look worried. Preacher's expression tightened. "He's probably noticed some of his men are out of position, the ones we had to relocate to reach certain devices. 4 of Carson's gang members were currently unconscious in various root cellars and storage rooms, having interfered with the bomb disposal operation." "How many more?" Thomas asked, checking his pocket watch. 2 in the Mercantile," Preacher consulted his notebook, "and 1 in the marshal's office. The Mercantile will be tricky. Carson's men use it as a secondary base. Always someone watching." Hannah made a decision. "I'll handle the Mercantile. The owner's daughter has a chronic cough. No one will question my visiting at odd hours." She met her father's concerned gaze. "We're running out of time." The storm seemed to intensify as the night deepened, as if nature herself was trying to delay the coming dawn. Near Devil's Throat, Nathan implemented the next phase of his strategy. Using skills learned from Arapaho hunters, he began working his way through Carson's perimeter, systematically dismantling their defensive preparations. A rifle would be found mysteriously jammed with snow. Ammunition pouches would develop holes, spilling precious cartridges into the drifts. Critical knots in shelter ropes would work themselves loose, leaving men exposed to the bitter wind. Each incident is small, seemingly random, but part of a calculated plan to degrade the gang's fighting capability. The Blackwood cousins huddled near a struggling fire, their wolf fur coats crackling with ice. "This ain't natural," Ezra muttered, jumping at every sound the wind made. "It's like the mountain itself is fighting us." "Shut up," Eli snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen too much in the past day to dismiss his brother's fears entirely. The strange tracks in the snow, the disappearing sentries, the constant feeling of being watched by something they couldn't see. It all added up to a horror he couldn't quite name. In the settlement, Hannah approached the Mercantile with her medical bag, the picture of a dedicated healer making her rounds. But beneath her calm exterior, her heart raced. 2 of Carson's men lounged near the entrance, watching her through narrowed eyes. "Kind of late for house calls, ain't it?" one called out, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Sickness doesn't keep regular hours," she replied steadily. "And little Amy's cough is getting worse. Unless you'd like to explain to Carson why you interfered with medical treatment. The implicit threat that they might be blamed if something happened to the child did its work." They stepped aside, grumbling but unwilling to take the responsibility. Inside, Hannah found Sarah Cooper had already arrived by the back door, preparing the ground with a mother's touch. Little Amy sat wrapped in a blanket while Sarah rocked her own baby, the picture of maternal concern. The girl's father, understanding the stakes, kept Carson's men distracted with offers of coffee and conversation, while Hannah located and disabled the hidden devices. Time seemed to crystallize like ice on a window pane as the night's deadly work continued. In the past, Nathan's strategic dismantling of Carson's defenses approached its culmination, and in Pine Valley Basin, the race to eliminate his insurance policy entered its final, most dangerous phase. Dawn was coming, bringing with it either salvation or destruction for the mountain settlement. The only question was which would arrive first, the supply wagon with its vital cargo, or the breaking point of Carson's increasingly fragile control. The final bomb was the most dangerous, concealed inside the marshal's office where two of Carson's most trusted men kept watch. As dawn approached with frigid determination, Hannah Wheeler knew they were running out of time. The supply wagon would reach Devil's Throat Pass in less than 2 hours, and every device had to be neutralized before then. "There's no legitimate reason for me to enter the marshal's office," she said, studying the building from the trading post's window. The storm had begun to ease, the first gray light of morning revealing a world transformed by snow and ice. "No," the preacher agreed quietly, "but there might be a reason for them to leave it." His academic tone carried a hint of steel as he outlined his plan. Minutes later, Sarah Cooper burst into the Silver Pine Saloon, her baby wailing in carefully rehearsed distress. "Carson's men!" she cried, tears freezing on her cheeks. "They're shooting up at Thunder Ridge. My husband's up there checking his traps." The performance was perfect. A desperate young mother creating exactly the kind of disturbance the gang couldn't ignore. The ruse worked. The guards at the marshal's office were summoned to help deal with the commotion, leaving Hannah and Thomas just enough time to locate and disable the final device. As her father's skilled hands cut the rawhide binding, Hannah felt the weight of the night's secret war lift from her shoulders. Carson's insurance policy was neutralized. Up in Devil's Throat Pass, Nathan's patient strategy had reached its culmination. Carson's men, exhausted and demoralized by the long night of psychological warfare, had compromised their defensive positions exactly as he'd planned. Now they were bunched together in predictable locations, seeking safety in numbers but actually making themselves more vulnerable. The gang leader himself stood at the narrowest point of the pass, his massive frame silhouetted against the lightning sky. "Show yourself, Ghost," he bellowed, voice echoing off the ice-covered walls. "Face me like a man instead of skulking in the shadows." "Why would I do that?" Nathan's quiet voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried by the wind itself. "When did the shadows serve me so well?" Carson spun, firing his revolver at movement that turned out to be nothing more than snow falling from a branch. His men flinched at the sound, weapons pointing nervously in different directions. The night's slow erosion of their confidence had left them jumping in the shadows. "You're nothing but a coward," Carson shouted, but there was a tremor in his voice that his men had never heard before. "A trickster playing games in the dark." "Games?" Nathan's soft response carried clearly in the pre-dawn stillness. "Like hiding bombs in a settlement? Planning to burn women and children in their beds?" His voice hardened slightly. "Or did you think I wouldn't find out about that?" The words hit Carson like physical blows. His head snapped toward Pine Valley Basin, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Preacher," he growled. "The sneaking bastard turned on us." "He chose," Nathan corrected quietly. "Just like your men are choosing right now." As if to emphasize his point, two more of Carson's gang members slipped away into the storm, deserting their positions. They can feel it coming. The smart ones are already running. A sound carried up from the south end of the pass, the creak of wagon wheels on snow. The supply wagon was approaching, right on schedule. Carson's face twisted into a savage grin. "Too late, Ghost. Once that wagon enters the pass, there's nowhere for it to go. Even you can't stop all of us at once." He raised his voice to rally his remaining men. "Get ready, boys. Today we show everyone what happens to those who defy the Carson gang." Actually, Nathan's voice came from a new direction, accompanied by the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. "I already have." Carson spun to find himself staring into the barrel of Nathan's Hawken rifle. The trapper had materialized from the storm like his namesake, so close that the gang leader could see the winter stillness in his eyes. "Impossible," Carson breathed, his hand tightening on his revolver. My men. Your men are gone, Nathan said softly. Some ran. Some surrendered. The rest are learning why they should have respected the storm instead of fighting it. His glacial gaze never wavered. You're alone, Carson. Just like all bullies end up in the end. The gang leader's face contorted with rage. He started to raise his gun, but Nathan was faster. Hawkins' report echoed through the pass like thunder, the bullet striking Carson's shoulder with surgical precision. The big man staggered, his revolver falling into the snow. You didn't kill me, Carson said, through gritted teeth clutching his wound. No, Nathan agreed quietly. Death's too easy. You're going to live, going to face the justice of every settlement you've terrorized, going to watch everything you built crumble while you sit in a territorial prison. As if on cue, horses appeared through the swirling snow. Hannah Wheeler rode at the head of a group of townspeople, armed and determined. Behind them came the supply wagon, safe and secure, and bringing up the rear was a contingent of territorial marshals, real ones this time, summoned by preachers' documented evidence of Carson's crimes. The dawn broke over Thunder Ridge, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and rose. Carson's empire had fallen not to superior force, but to the quiet strength of a community united against tyranny. Nathan watched as the former gang leader was led away in chains, his threats and bravado falling as silent as snow in the face of winter's justice. Later, as the townspeople celebrated the arrival of vital supplies and their newfound freedom, Hannah found Nathan preparing his gear near the trading post. You're not leaving? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. Storm's breaking, he replied softly. Trail will be clear soon. There are other storms coming, she said. Other battles worth fighting. Her hand found his, warm despite the mountain cold. And sometimes the greatest strength isn't in wandering, but in finding a place worth calling home. Nathan looked at her, then at the settlement that had found its courage in the longest night. For the first time, a real smile touched his lips, warming even his glacial eyes. Might be you're right about that, he said quietly. Might be the ghost has wandered long enough. The wind carried the sound of children's laughter from the town square, where the community gathered to share food and warmth. And in that moment, as winter's fury gave way to spring's promise, a solitary hunter finally found his true home in the high country he'd roamed for so long. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.